Alright, welcome back everyone. I am an avid herpetologist. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be trying to do a reshoot of a video I posted a couple of days ago. This is going to be my first attempt, or second I guess, of doing a Yu-Gi-Oh deck tech. Turns out Yu-Gi-Oh cards have a lot more text on them than Digimon cards. I do play Yu-Gi-Oh quite a bit. I also play Magic. I'm going to try to post one of those later tonight as well. But we're going to try to do this in a little bit of a different format, which is hopefully going to be a little smoother for you guys. So hopefully this will be a little better than the first attempt. For those of you who do know me in real life, I am going to be starting with a water deck profile for Yu-Gi-Oh! I am an avid water enthusiast. For those of you who have not met me in real life, I actually worked at an aquarium for about 8 years. It's one of the jobs that I had wanted to have since I was a kid. Super glad to have gotten that opportunity. But I've loved animals ever since I was little, which is why the channel name is Avid Herpetologist. I'm a big reptile guy. You'll see that in a little bit of the deck text I post in the coming weeks. But to begin with, as I mentioned, I would be in the wrong if the first Yu-Gi-Oh deck I went over was not a water archetype. So the first deck we're going to be going over is one I officially refer to affectionately as Aquarium Control. You can also call it Umi Control. It's basically just the Mako Tsunami archetype that released a couple of months ago. So we're going to go through each one of our lineups, monsters, spells, and traps. I'll kind of explain what the deck wants to do, a little bit about what the cards do, and kind of explain how the strategy itself works. This deck is actually very fun. It's kind of a hybrid control and OTK archetype. So to begin with, we're going to go over our monsters. We have 3 copies of Electric Jellyfish. We have 3 copies of Ocean Dragon Lord Kairyu-Shin, a single copy of Doom Kraken, 1 copy of Mega Fortress Whale, a single copy of Giga Gagagigo, and 3 copies of Warrior of Atlantis. Alright, so the bread and butter creature setup of this deck, the cards that you want to try to see as consistently as you can on turn 1 are these first 2. So we're going to talk about them first. Specifically, we have Electric Jellyfish and Ocean Dragon Lord Kairyu-Shin. These cards play very well together, and just by opening these 2 cards, you can actually set up an incredibly powerful board state just with these 2 cards tutoring 2 additional cards, and then it creates this really, really strong board that your opponent's going to have a really hard time getting over, barring things such as Kaiju, Lava Golem, and things like that. So we'll go over what their effects do. To begin with, Electric Jellyfish. This is one of the best startup cards the deck has to offer. It does have a couple of relevant effects that I'm going to summarize briefly. While it's on the field, you can send any copy of Umi from your deck or hand to the graveyard to summon any water monster you want from your hand to the field. Now, I'll be completely honest with you guys. When this archetype first came out, my very first desire was to try to make use of old cards called Leviathan Dragon Daedalus and Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus. A lot of my friends will recall that when I first was starting to get into Yu-Gi-Oh, the very first deck I ever built way back in the day, we're talking like, oh goodness, at this point it was like 2011, 2012. So not like the earliest days of Yu-Gi-Oh, but that was when I joined. The first deck I tried to build was a Legendary Ocean deck built around those cards. Obviously back in the day that was a strategy that was not super consistent, but the effect was absolutely backbreaking if you could make it work. The problem is it's not as backbreaking as it used to be. Unfortunately, sending your opponent's entire hand and field to the graveyard doesn't nearly do as much as it needs to do back in the day, where now so many decks play out of the graveyard that it might as well still be in their hand. In fact, some decks, like the very recently released Tier Elements archetype, if you send their entire hand to their graveyard, they are going to style all over you. You do not want to send their hand to the graveyard by card effect. So it's one of those things where, as much as I love the card, Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus is still to this day probably my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh card. Sadly, he is well past his prime. He just doesn't do enough. For the record, I actually did build a deck that was able to summon out Ocean Dragon Lord Daedalus with this support very consistently. The problem is, even when you use his effect and wipe the whole board, it's usually just not enough. They're going to end up absolutely demolishing you because now your hand is gone as well. But anyways, back to this archetype. So this is a much stronger and much more resilient engine that we're going to be running. So Electric Jellyfish summons any water monster from your hand. Ideally, if you're going turn 1, you want to be summoning a copy of Kairyu-Shin out from your hand as well. This deck does run quite a bit of searching, so you're going to try to get both of those pieces as consistently as you can. Now, Electric Jellyfish has another effect where once per turn during either turn, if Umi is in play, you can negate any monster or spell effect your opponent tries to activate. It does not destroy, so if it's a monster effect, it would stay in play, but the effect would still be negated. And then, instead of destroying the effect, it actually gains 600 attack and defense. It's very funny if you can protect this card long enough that its attack starts to skyrocket. It starts at a measly 1400 1600 with Legendary Ocean in play, but it will climb very quickly if a couple of turns go by and you're not able to end the game yet. Very, very cool. So this is your first startup piece. But this is really the card that you want to start the game in play. Ocean Dragonlord Kairyu-Shin is very much the card that lets this deck, I'll use the phrase, be competitive. I don't necessarily think this deck is going to top anything major just because I don't think it's either consistent enough or maybe just people aren't aware of it. I don't know. But this is definitely a deck that I intend to start bringing to some locals just to have some fun with. So this card has an effect where if it's in play and you have Umi on the board, neither player can control more than one monster that is not water attribute. It is basically a Gozen match that just kind of wipes the board when it comes down. In some ways, it's a better Gozen match because they can't have multiple attributes out. They are stuck with whatever their first thing is unless it is water attribute. So decks that have multiple attributes, think things such as, AIs, or to a certain extent, decks like Sword Souls. Even though the token is water attribute, if they summon a Sword Soul that itself is not water, they can get the token. But unless they go into something that itself is water attribute, I guess maybe like, Dragite, they won't be able to actually summon anything else. They're just kind of stuck there, which is super, super cool, super, super fun. Now, Kairyu-Shin also has the effect where once per turn on your own turn, you can add any Sea Stealth spell or trap, any Kairyu-Shin spell or trap, or any copy of Umi directly from your deck to your hand. So these two cards by themselves will help you set up Umi as well as additional protection. So Electric Jellyfish sends the copy of Umi from deck to graveyard. Kairyu-Shin then tutors a trap card that actually lets you activate the Umi directly from your graveyard. So with just these two cards, not even needing any additional setup, you can get your field spell out, a trap that gives extra protection, spell or monster negate, and a floodgate where your opponent is more than likely only going to be able to have one monster in play for the rest of the game. Like, that's awesome. I think this deck is just so much fun. Being able to just set those two cards up, two main board boss monsters, and just say pass with multiple negations, it's absolutely wild. Like, I just think this deck is so neat. It's everything that I have ever wanted from a water control deck, so super excited. Now, the next card we're talking about, we're actually going to skip Doom Kraken real quick. We're going to talk about this guy. This is actually the card that lets us really win the game. So I'm running one copy of Mega Fortress Whale. Now this whale technically has 3 effects, but really it's only 2. The third one's kind of flavor text. We don't really play any water warrior monsters, so we don't really worry about that. So this card has 2 effects. The first effect is on your opponent's turn during their battle phase. Once per turn, you can destroy any monster they control. So it's just kind of like an extra little gravy protection effect. You can summon this out on your opponent's turn pretty easily through a couple of different effects, so being able to bring it out and then pop something, super nice. But the effect we really care about is the second effect. On your turn, while Umi is in play, you can activate this effect where for the rest of the turn, your water monsters can attack your opponent directly. So with just this in play, Kairyu-Shin, Electric Jellyfish, and this, which is very easy to do, you only really need one other monster in play to 8,000 to 0 your opponent in a single turn. No monsters they have in play will stop the attacks. You've still got spell negates and things like that. Really all you're worried about is trap effects, which some exist, I suppose, but they're not nearly as common as they used to be. So it's just a really strong, pretty consistent OTK strategy. It's really, really cool. But when you are trying to set up your OTK, you also need a way to not die, specifically a way for them to not weasel out of the board lockdown that you have put them under. That is where this card comes into play. This is Doom Kraken. Now this is actually the deck's in-archetype hand trap. I'm currently only running 1. You are more than welcome to run more than 1. I have actually considered running more than 1 because I think this card is actually really good. It's especially strong when you play it in combo with your other original setups. But it has 2 effects. The hand trap effect is while it is in your hand and Umi is in play, you can target a water monster you have on the field and one of your opponent's monsters. Then you return the monster that you targeted to your hand, summon the Doom Kraken to the field, and then destroy the monster you targeted on your opponent's side of the field. So it's a nice little hand trap. It's extra interaction, especially nice with things like Electric Jellyfish, where if you've already used your spell or monster negate, that card is basically just a sitting target, so you can then bounce it to your hand, get an extra pop off of it, and now you have not lost anything in board presence as Doom Kraken replaces it. But Doom Kraken also has another super awesome in-play effect, where if your opponent declares an attack, whether or not you have Umi in play, it does not require it, you can actually return this card from play to your hand in order to negate that attack. The reason that's relevant is if they're only able to have one monster in play at a time, for instance, Kairyu-Shin being in play, they may try to swing into your Kairyu-Shin in order to kill off their monster, because they may have a more ideal play in their hand that they just can't get to while their current monster is in play. Well, if they try to swing in, we use this to bounce that monster back, negate that attack, and now they are still stuck with that same monster, and they have no way of getting it off the board, presumably. Obviously, there's going to be ways to do it, but it puts them in a much more difficult position where they're not going to be able to weasel out of your lock as well as they normally would be able to. So it's a super cool card. Like I said, you can try more than one copy. I may try more than one copy myself, but currently we are just playing one in this list. We are also playing a single copy of Giga Gagagigo. This is not here for the name meme. It is here because it is the best at the role that it's trying to fill. Basically what I mean by that is there's actually a lot of cards in the Umi support right now that let you summon water normal monsters for free, either from your deck or from your hand. So you could go tall with it, use, for instance, Giga Gagagigo, which is the biggest thing you'd probably be able to summon off of that as a normal monster. Or you can just do level 4 plays, things like Megalo Smasher Q, or X, I mean. This, however, is my personal choice because it is level 5. Which basically means that in your hand, if you have Legendary Ocean in play, it becomes level 4, so you can normal summon it. It is the biggest thing that we are going to be able to do normal summoning with the biggest attack stat. It has 2450 base, which means 2650 with Umi in play. That also is very easy to use as our extra body for Mega Fortress Whale. That's why we're running him to begin with. I know a lot of builds just don't run the normal monsters because they're kind of considered bricks in some cases. I think this is probably the least bricky of the ones that you can potentially run, just because, again, you can normal summon it. And because it is level 5 or higher normally, again, it gets built-in protection that we're going to talk about a little later through the trap that we tutor off of Kairyu-Shin. So yeah, it's super cool. It's basically going to serve as that extra body that you need in order to fulfill your Mega Fortress Whale OTK most of the time. So this is, he's just kind of there. He's there to fill that extra little gravy train on some of your other cards. And then the last playset of cards, I don't need to talk about super deep. It's Warrior of Atlantis. It's a 1900 body, so it's okay on the field, but its main reason it's in here is it's 3 extra copies of Umi. By discarding it from hand to graveyard, you can add any copy of Legendary Ocean from your deck to your hand. So it's just 3 extra copies of our field spell, which obviously is going to be very important for the strategy. Now we're going to be moving on to our spell cards. The first, of course, we're going to have to talk about is a Legendary Ocean, the card the entire deck revolves around. So this card is considered Umi at all times, even when the deck, so you can bin it with your Electric Jellyfish, super important. It is a field spell that, as I mentioned, reduces the levels of all water monsters in hand and field by 1, and increases all water monsters' attacks by 200 defense as well. So the really cool interaction with this card that I think actually comes up more than you might think. We don't care what level our water monsters are. We don't use our extra deck in this deck. All of our aggression, all of our board control, it all comes from our main board water monsters. So we don't actually touch our extra deck. It's disposable. So the reason I mention that is that one level reduction, most other water decks that you're going to see, and there are a few going around, think things such as, mermaids, paleozoics, frogs, sharks, if you happen to run across those, they tend to actually care about what level their monsters are. Well, if you're reducing all water monsters levels by 1, it's not only a field spell that helps set your own deck up, it's kind of this weird floodgate that they have to figure out a way to play through, which I think is actually super funny. They're going to be off-level for their synchros, off-level for their Xyz plays. I just think that interaction is very amusing. Sprites I know are becoming very popular right now, and they play the Frog engine. Well, they're not going to be able to summon Totally Awesome if this card's in play. So just a fun little thing that won't come up all the time, but it literally is the card the deck is built around anyway, so that's just a little extra gravy on there. The next spell card we're playing, let's go ahead and put them all out. So we're going to be playing 3 copies of Fish Sonar, a single copy of Sea Stealth 2, 2 copies of Fury of Kairyu-Shin. We are playing 3 copies of Foolish Burial Goods, a single copy of Terraforming, a single copy of Harpie's Feather Duster. We are playing 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance, a single copy of Called by the Grave. Alright, so we're going to go through each of these. We'll start with the most important in my opinion, and that's going to be Fish Sonar. So this is another one of the new Mako support cards. This card is really, really helpful. It's honestly the reason this deck is able to compete, if you're willing to say that it's able to compete. So this card is a Rhoda for the archetype. So it lets you add any level 7 or lower monster from your deck to your hand that mentions Umi or is a water normal monster. lets it add from deck to hand. Then if Umi is already in play, when you activate this card, you also get to summon, as I mentioned, a free water normal monster from your deck straight to the field. So think about it as a Rhoda that also just kind of lets you drop Giga Gagagigo for free just for playing the game. So super, super cool. It's also our consistency engine. So it's what's going to let us see the two cards that we really want to open with most. If we have one and this, we search the other. So that's our consistency piece. Now the next card is kind of hard to explain. So I'm gonna take a little bit to talk about Sea Stealth 2, because this card has a couple of effects with some weird interactions, but this card is actually really cool. So first of all, while in play or in the graveyard, it is considered Umi. This is a continuous spell card, not a field spell. It, while in play, gives all of your water monsters the immunity from being targeted by monster effects that are not water monsters. So basically, it's like a little built-in shield. Now, that is not the reason you play the card. Again, that is just icing on the cake for you. It just happens to also protect your water monsters from being targeted by monster effects. But the reason this card is good, number one, it is, again, a Sea Stealth attack, so you can tutor it off of your Kairyu-Shin. Counts as Umi in play, which is good for your synergies. Make sure that even if they find a way to get rid of your Legendary Ocean, you still have an Umi to keep your effects live. But it also has a really cool during combat effect. So at the beginning of the battle phase on either turn, you can summon any water monster that mentions Umi from your graveyard or your hand, or any water normal monster from graveyard or hand directly to the field. So the really cool play that this has, if your board does happen to get wiped, first of all, it helps you set back up. Now, the water monster you're summoning does actually destroy itself at the end of the battle phase, but we have a way to get around that. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically what this does is if your opponent does wipe the board and they try to go in, there's a couple of things that this card can do to absolutely save your bacon. First of all, as long as they don't have a way to negate this effect at the start of the battle phase, if they have set a board up and are trying to swing in for a lot of damage, start of the battle phase, this effect can bring your Kairyu-Shin back from the graveyard or just summon a fresh one from hand. As soon as it enters, they have to sacrifice down to only one monster. It is not a triggered effect, so before any effects can go into play to respond, as long as this hits the field, they have to sacrifice their board down. So it's a great way to reduce what they had. And after that point, you now have a body. So the last card that they had in play, they can either swing into it and kill it, which again, it was going to die anyways. Or if you have the trap in play that is going to make this card better, that we'll get to in a second, it'll also give Kairyu-Shin destruction by battle immunity, by destroying the opponent's monster automatically whenever it does battle. So it's a really, really cool card. Like I said, I'm only running one copy. I don't think it's super necessary to run a bunch of those. But it's definitely a really nice tech card that can help your board recover if you ever do fall behind. It's just worth mentioning. More than one copy of Umi in play can also matter. And again, there's a trap card we'll talk about later for that. Next up, we have Fury of Kairyu-Shin. It's a very basic card. It is a Kairyu-Shin spell. So again, tutors off of your Ocean Dragon Lord Kairyu-Shin. Has a very simple effect where it just adds a Torrential Tribute from your deck to your hand. We are running 2 copies. And it has a nice little graveyard effect where if your water monster, or any of your water monsters, would be destroyed by a card effect, you can banish it from the graveyard in order to prevent that deletion. The reason that matters, of course, is when you're tutoring Torrential Tribute, it makes your Torrential Tribute one-sided. Now, we are running 3 copies of Foolish Burial Goods. The main target you're going to want for this is one of our traps, but let's say that you don't need that. You already have your setup and you're just looking for something to kind of push or protect your board. You can also just bin one of these as an extra layer of protection. It's kind of like a Return of the Dragon Lords effect, but it is worth mentioning this does not protect your monsters from being destroyed by battle, so just be aware of that. Just talked about Foolish Burial Goods. There are a couple cards that we'd like to send to the graveyard. Again, the main one's going to be a trap that we'll get to in a second. A copy of Terraforming, extra copies of Legendary Ocean. We want to see that in our opening hand as frequently as we can. We also have a single copy of Harpie's Feather Duster. This card is really helpful, even though we do have some spell protection thanks to our Electric Jellyfish. If we're going to be going in for the OTK with Fortress Whale, we don't have a lot of ways to handle traps, so that's basically just a way to kind of clear that board off and hopefully protect your swing and make sure you can get that OTK in. We are playing 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance. As I mentioned, our extra deck is just a resource. We are not summoning anything from it, so why not run cards that basically send those resources away to give us 2 free cards? It is quite literally a Pot of Greed that you can only use once per turn, so super, super strong. And last, of course, is Called by the Grave. Gotta run the one of when you got a lot of tutors in the deck and you don't want your combos to get stopped. Now, this deck can play through potentially an Ash Blossom. If I, for instance, already have Kairyu-Shin in hand and I don't have Electric Jellyfish, but I'm able to get the Legendary Ocean in play, I don't need to start with Electric Jellyfish. Just being able to normal summon Kairyu-Shin is usually a pretty good board state on its own, where you can tutor up an extra card, any of the protection spells you really want, or traps. So it's not super necessary to get through the Ash Blossom. Sometimes we can just play through it anyways, but Called by the Grave is, of course, just a bonkers card. I don't need to explain any more about it. You guys know how good it is. We're going to move on to our traps, and we're going to talk about the card I've been alluding to the whole video. In my opinion, one of the best cards in the deck, and that is Sea Stealth Attack. Now, Sea Stealth Attack has actually been out for a couple of years, but it is now basically the linchpin in this strategy. It has a couple of, three specifically, very good effects, all three of which help this deck kind of accomplish what it wants to do. So first of all, it is a Sea Stealth trap, once again, tutored off of Kairyu-Shin. It is a continuous trap. When this card is activated, you can activate any copy of Umi you want from your graveyard or your hand. So if Sea Stealth Attack already has been, out and gone, you can bring it back, reactivate it, just as a little extra copy of Umi if you want. It also just lets you activate Legendary Ocean if you've sent it to the graveyard off of Electric Jellyfish. So a very basic, very bare bones open is you just have these two cards in hand. You summon your Electric Jellyfish, summon Kairyu-Shin, using the effect of Electric Jellyfish, sending Legendary Ocean from deck to graveyard. Kairyu-Shin effect then adds Sea Stealth Attack from your deck to your hand, and assuming you don't have another 3 cards in your hand at the start of your turn, you would then set Sea Stealth Attack. When your opponent's turn begins, assuming they don't have instant speed, spell and trap removal such as Twin Twisters, you activate this, Legendary Ocean enters play. Now you not only have an active Floodgate, you have a free spell or monster negate as well, and you have the other effect of Sea Stealth Attack, which I'm going to talk about now. While Umi is in play, there are 2 additional effects that this card gains. The first is that it will actually protect your back row. So this card has an effect where once per turn, you can banish any water monster you control until the end of this turn in order to make it so that face-up spell or traps that you control cannot be destroyed by card effects for the rest of the turn. So let's say that they go for a Lightning Storm, Harpie's Feather Duster. Let's say that they draw into a Twin Twisters after this is already in play, and you don't feel like using your Electric Jellyfish's spell negate in order to stop those cards. Instead, you can just banish any of the water monsters you have in play, and now for the rest of the turn, these cards are set and safe. They are not going anywhere, unless, of course, they get an effect such as, Cosmic Cyclone, which is going to happen. But again, if you're protecting these using its effect, you then have Electric Jellyfish's effect to protect from Galaxy Cyclone. So there's a lot of ways to protect your spells and traps, which is something that Umi strategies have always lacked. Having that protection helps your cards stay in play longer. It helps your boards be harder to break. So this card is really, really phenomenal. But the other effect that it has that I think is underrated in a lot of ways is while Umi is in play, anytime one of your originally level 5 or higher water monsters does battle, so if Kairyu-Shin is level 4 from Legendary Ocean, it does still work. Anytime originally level 5 or higher water monster does battle, at the start of the damage step, destroy the monster that it is battling. So basically, unless they have immunity to destruction effects, they can't swing over any of your level 5 or higher water monsters. Again, that's going to be one of the reasons I opt to play the single copy of Giga Gagagigo. If this is in play, along with Sea Stealth Attack and Umi is active, they can't swing over it. It is, for all intents and purposes, immune to destruction by battle, which is super, super nice. So that is the extra effect. Now, there's also some really important synergies for Sea Stealth Attack. First and foremost, as I mentioned, banishing a water monster in order to protect your back row. You might be thinking, well, if we just have Electric Jellyfish and Kairyu-Shin in play, obviously we don't want to really banish those. Well, we can potentially lead with our Physalia, that's the Japanese name, the Electric Jellyfish's spell or monster negate. Once that's used, it's basically, again, a sitting target, so you can always just exile it to Sea Stealth Attack in order to keep them from swinging over it while also keeping your back row safe. So if you do just have these 2 in play at the start of that battle phase, and they are trying to swing in over your Electric Jellyfish, exile it to your Sea Stealth Attack, then Kairyu-Shin is left in play, unable to be swung over thanks to the effect of Sea Stealth Attack. It's really a really solid lock. But the other really important synergy to mention, you can always banish your Giga Gagagigo that was summoned off of Fish Sonar, things like that. But also, it has a very good interaction with Sea Stealth 2. Let's say that your board does get wiped, and you are left with nothing in play. Well, now, thanks to these 2 cards, the start of your battle phase, you can bring any of the cards back that you want. Probably Kairyu-Shin is usually the one that I recommend beginning with. You can then, at the end of the battle phase, when this goes to activate to destroy that monster, you can banish it off of Sea Stealth Attack, make sure that it comes back at the end phase of the turn, and now that monster gets to stay in play permanently. So it basically lets you rebuild your board. So super helpful there. Next up, we're going to play a single copy of Kairyu-Shin's Dark Reef. We are playing 2 copies of Torrential Tribute, 2 copies of Ice Barrier, and 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. So Kairyu-Shin's Dark Reef is a pretty cool card, one of my favorites in the deck actually. It can be a little awkward to set up, but if you're playing the deck properly and you're able to effectively control the board, this card is basically what's going to help enable your OTK. So over the course of a couple turns, you're going to want to use Kairyu-Shin to tutor out this, tutor out your Sea Stealth attack as a second copy of Umi. I'll go ahead and explain what it does. So basically what this does is when it activates, it is a normal trap card. You send a face-up copy of Umi to the graveyard in order to summon any 2 monsters from your deck that mention Umi in their card text. Then, if your opponent controls a monster on the field, any monster at all, you can summon as many water normal monsters as possible from your deck directly to the field. So this is one of the reasons some people do play more copies of the normal monsters, is this trap will literally just dump as many as possible onto the field at once. I found that's kind of win more. You don't really need more. If I activate this and I'm going for the win, the game's probably over. I probably already have these 2 in play. This is more than likely going to fetch out copies of Doom Kraken and Mega Fortress Whale on my opponent's turn. Ideally, again, we want to have both of these in play so we can send one but still have an active Umi just to make sure we don't lose our nice onboard effects. But this is going to set us up with so much power that we will be able to just swing in for lethal on the next turn. So that's the nice OTK setup. That's why I'm only running a single copy. You're not going to want to see it super often, but even if you have an empty board, it will be able to at least give you bodies that can block. There are plenty of effects that have things that do things even when Umi isn't already in play. So let's say you just open with Ocean and this, at least you can still get bodies to try to defend yourself until the next turn. We are playing 2 copies of Torrential Tribute. This card is very old. I'm not going to explain what it does. It's very basic. Just monster gets summoned, activate it, all monsters on the field are destroyed. It's one-sided if you've played it off after a Fury of Kairyu-Shin, so very straightforward. Now the card I'm not sure that a whole lot of people have probably heard of before. This card is Ice Barrier. If you have heard of it, kudos. Again, I don't think this card is seeing a lot of competitive play. Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Please don't hate me if I'm wrong. But this is the card that's going to, again, be a nice consistency piece. This is what we're going to want to send to our graveyard off of Foolish Burial Goods. Now, it does have a relevant on-board effect, where if your opponent is attacking one of your creatures or directly, you can activate this, reduce the attacking monster's attack to 0, negate that monster's effects, and make it so it cannot change its battle phase, or not change its battle position, as long as that card is in play. So this card is kind of nice. It's not going to come up all the time, but at least it's better than just being blank and only having a graveyard effect. But the graveyard effect is what we really care about. The graveyard effect says, during either turn, of course, since it's a trap, banish this card from your graveyard, send any level 5 or higher water monster from your deck to the graveyard. After you do that, you can then add any water monster you want from graveyard right to your hand. So this is going to be binned off of Foolish Burial Goods. You're going to want to exile it immediately, send Kairyu-Shin to the graveyard, and then add Kairyu-Shin straight back to your hand. So it's going to be extra copies of him that you're going to see. So basically, since Kairyu-Shin is the most important card, we basically have 3 base copies, 3 copies of Fish Sonar, and 3 copies of Foolish Burial Goods to try to see that in our hand as frequently as we can. Now the last 3 cards I'm running are copies of Infinite Impermanence. Of course, this is going to be a card that's just another hand trap where you can play it as long as you have no cards in play. Negate something's effect, so it's kind of like an effect veiler, but it's on a trap body. If you are wondering why I am choosing to play Infinite Impermanence over Effect Veiler, there's going to be times where we need our Sea Stealth attack to stay in play until our opponent's turn so we can activate it, and we may need to bluff some potential spell and trap removal. Just as one potentially common example is, of course, Phoenix Destroyer Enforcer, whatever the stupid thing is, DPE. Destroy Phoenix Enforcer, that's the one. If Destroy Phoenix Enforcer is in play, as I'm sure all of you are painfully aware of, they're going to be popping things every turn cycle. So on your turn, they're going to pop something. On their turn, they're going to pop something. On your turn, they're going to pop something. So basically, if we have a more loaded back row, we're giving them more chances to blank that removal. Additionally, this is a card that I'm more than happy, of course, to just set and use as a back row spell or back row trap, but giving them multiple things that they have to try to find your Sea Stealth attack is going to give you a better chance of actually activating it. Now, of course, they could 100% just wait until their turn and then use an effect then. If they do that, first of all, your Impermanence is then activated, so if they're going by monster effect, well, now you can negate the effect that's trying to destroy it. But unless they have spell speed 2 removal like Twin Twisters or Galaxy Cyclone, they're not going to be able to respond to this during the standby phase anyway with spell or traps. So just having that and getting it resolving effectively is one of the big goals that this deck does have. So that's going to be my reasoning for playing this over Effect Veiler, is just because giving extra face downs to bluff with, it does come up. So that's the primary reasoning for that. Yeah, so that's going to be it as far as my main board is concerned. There's not a lot to talk about with my extra deck just because, as I mentioned, I don't really use it. My extra deck is strictly there as a free resource for Pot of Extravagance. Should they ever play the Dogmatica cards that send cards from extra deck to graveyard, we want to get free bonuses. Why would we not play those cards? So it's basically just going to be 5 different play sets of 3. And each one of those cards is going to have effects that when they go to the graveyard, you get some bonuses. So we're going to cover those very quickly here. To begin with, we do have 3 copies of Cyber Dragon Nova. When sent to the graveyard, this card will let you summon any light machine directly from your extra deck. The card we're summoning, of course, everyone already knows it. It's Invoked Makaba. We are playing 3 copies just in case we banish a few off of our pots. We are playing a pretty good split of spells, traps, and monsters, so ideally we're going to have a pretty diverse range of cards to discard to this first negate effect. We are also playing 3 copies of Garura, Wings of Resonant Life. This is a relatively new card with an effect where anytime it's sent to the graveyard, you just draw a card. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic, but definitely nice to have. We're also going to be playing 3 copies of Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. This is a guy where you can, on your turn, banish him from the graveyard to destroy a monster your opponent controls. And of course, the end-all be-all of extra deck send to graveyard effects, 3 copies of Elder Entity Nts, where if it's sent to the graveyard, you can destroy any card your opponent controls right away. So yeah, this is pretty much it. These are probably pretty standard. I'm sure none of these cards were a surprise to you. I will say I have considered running copies of Super Polymerization in my main board just to make use of Garura as something other than just fodder. In those cases, I would probably also run extra copies of like Muddy Mud Dragon and things like that. But there's also the possibility that I could just side copies of Super Polymerization, which is probably something I'm going to do when I do start going to locals. But yeah, that's it, guys. I hope you guys have all enjoyed this first ever Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck Tech on my channel. Hopefully it was a little less cringy than the first one that I attempted. I do plan on doing quite a few more of these, but I would definitely have been remiss if the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck was not a water deck. That's definitely what I'm known for by my friends and the people that I play with. So I had to start with a good water strategy, and this one is just an absolute blast to talk about. I think it is super, super fun. If you're looking for something that's not Tier 1, something that's a little different, that you just kind of want to mix up your gameplay, highly recommend this. It's a very solid control deck. It's very consistent. But yeah, thanks guys so much for watching. I hope you did enjoy this deck tech. I'll be posting more in the coming weeks. I may try to do my first Magic deck tech tonight or in the coming days as well. If you did enjoy the video, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions to make the deck stronger or criticisms. I'll happily take those as well. But yeah, with that, thank you all so much. My name is an avid herpetologist, and I will see you all next time.